The stagecoach had turned back an hour before sundown, its driver muttering about the swollen river and bad omens. Clara Hale stood alone on the muddy track, the echo of the departing wheels fading into the wet hush of the valley. All around her the land breathed mist and cold, the kind of silence that made a person hear their own heartbeat. She gathered her shawl tighter, though the rain had long soaked through the wool. The ranch lay somewhere ahead, Jonas Cutter's place, a scatter of rooflines she'd glimpsed from the ridge that morning before the storm rolled in. Each step squelched through mud, her skirts dragging like anchors. She carried only a carpetbag and a folded letter, its ink blurred by travel. The letter was written in her husband's hand, a debt owed, a promise made. If anything happens to me, Cutter will see you right. The words had guided her through 3 states and a dozen disappointments, and now they led her through a river valley smelling of thawing earth and old sorrow. By the time she reached the homestead, dusk had bled into full night. A single lantern burned inside the house, throwing yellow light across the yard. The place was smaller than she'd imagined, more worn, a barn with half its roof caved in, a fence line leaning like old men in the wind. The river whispered somewhere close by, swollen and restless. She climbed the porch steps and knocked once. Then twice. The door opened partway. A man stood there, broad-shouldered and rough as fence post wood. The shotgun in his hand gleamed faintly in the lamplight. His eyes were shadowed beneath the brim of a hat. "Evening," she managed, voice hoarse from the cold. "I'm looking for Jonas Cutter." "You found him," he said. His tone held no welcome, only the weight of a man who'd long stopped expecting company. "I'm Clara Hale." She hesitated, watching his expression shift. "Eli Hale's widow." At the sound of her husband's name, Jonas's grip on the shotgun loosened slightly, but his jaw worked, as though he were grinding something bitter between his teeth. He stepped aside, wordless, letting her pass. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and coffee gone cold. The room was simple. A stove, a table, a cot against the far wall. Tools leaned in the corner beside a saddle worn smooth with use. She stood dripping on the floorboards, while he set the gun by the door. "You came a long way," he said finally. "I had nowhere else to go." He studied her. The soaked shawl, the mud on her hem, the way she kept her hands clasped tight to stop their trembling. Then he moved toward the stove and fed it another log. Sparks climbed the flue like fireflies escaping into the dark. "There's stew left," he said. "It ain't much. I'd be grateful." They ate in silence. The wind pressed against the shutters, carrying the faint hiss of rain on river water. Clara's hunger surprised her. She hadn't eaten since dawn. But each spoonful felt heavy, as if every bite tied her to the strangeness of this place. Jonas ate little, his eyes somewhere distant, his movements careful, almost weary. When she finally spoke, her voice came soft. "You knew him, didn't you?" "Eli." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and poured black coffee into 2 tin mugs, set one before her, then leaned against the counter, arms folded. "Yeah," he said at last. "We rode together once. Cattle drive up from Texas, long time ago." Something in his voice told her not to ask more. The silence stretched again, but it felt different now. Not empty, but brimming with things neither dared to touch. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills, slow and distant. She took off her shawl and laid it near the stove to dry. The flickering firelight threw her shadow across the wall, thin, ghost-like. Jonas moved to fetch a spare blanket and laid it across a cot near the hearth. "You can take that one," he said. "Ain't much comfort, but it's warm enough." "You're kind," she said. He gave a small shake of his head. "Just writin' what's due." The words stung more than she expected. She wanted to say she hadn't come for charity, only to settle her husband's unfinished debts. But exhaustion pinned her to the chair. The journey, the cold, the unending ache of being unmoored from everything she'd once known. It all settled on her shoulders like wet cloth. Jonas glanced toward her again, his face unreadable in the half-light. He was a man built for work, not talk, every line of him drawn by wind and time. Scars ran along one forearm, silver against sun-worn skin. When he caught her looking, he turned away, busying himself with the fire. "River's bad this time of year," he said quietly. "Takes things without warning, horses, fences, people sometimes," she shivered. "You live close to it." "Too close," he admitted. "But I was here first before it started eating away the banks. Hard to move once a place has your bones in it." Clara nodded, understanding more than she could say. Loss, once it roots itself, has a way of binding you to what remains. She lay down on the cot that night, listening to the rain ease into a soft patter. The stove crackled low. Jonas sat by the window, watching the river's restless glint beyond the glass. Neither spoke. Somewhere deep in the night, the wind shifted. The smell of wet sage drifted through the cracks. Clara turned beneath the blanket, staring at the ceiling beams, heavy, dark, like the ribs of an old ship carrying her towards something she didn't yet recognize. Jonas still hadn't moved. He sat like a sentry, his outline cut against the lamplight. For a brief, flickering moment, she thought she saw the weight behind his stillness. Not anger, but guilt shaped into silence. She closed her eyes, letting the sound of rain fill the room. Outside, the river kept rising, whispering against its banks. Inside, two strangers sat in the quiet, bound by a shared ghost neither yet understood. Tone and realization, bleak, restrained, and haunted. Both Clara and Jonas carry the heavy inheritance of loss, hers from death, his from guilt. Yet beneath the storm and silence, a fragile thread of endurance takes root. Sometimes survival begins not with kindness, but with a door reluctantly opened. The day slipped by with the rhythm of chores and silence. The rain eased, leaving the air smelling of mud and pine sap. Each morning, Clara rose before dawn, kindled the fire, and boiled coffee so dark it bit the tongue. Jonas would already be outside, hammer echoing faintly through the valley as he mended fences and drove new posts into the thawing ground. The ranch had once been proud. She could see it in the bones of the place. But now the fences sagged, the barn leaned like an old drunk, and the porch bore the weary creak of years. A rocking chair sat there, worn smooth at the arms, its seat sagged from long use. She could almost picture someone sitting there once. A woman, perhaps, watching the river's bend, waiting for someone who never came home. She worked to repay his reluctant kindness. She swept the dust from corners, scrubbed pots until they shone, coaxed life from the small patch of earth behind the house. Her hands blistered, but she welcomed the ache. It gave shape to the emptiness. Sometimes, as she hung laundry in the pale sunlight, she caught Jonas watching from the pasture, hat brim low, expression unreadable. At night, when the lamps were dimmed and the crickets took over the world, she'd hear him pacing, slow, measured steps across the boards, back and forth, until the small hours. A man haunted, wrestling ghosts too proud to leave him be. One morning, while tidying the table, Clara found a leather-bound Bible tucked beneath a stack of old letters. It fell open to a pressed sprig of sagebrush, and a small photograph slipped between the pages. The image was faded, edges curled, but clear enough. Jonas, younger and unscarred, with a woman beside him, dark-haired, her hand resting on the shoulder of a little girl no older than 5. All three stood before the same house Clara now called shelter. She held it for a long moment before setting it back. The quiet in the room seemed to deepen around it, as though memory itself had paused to watch her. That evening, when Jonas came in from the pasture, his coat dusted with the gold of dry grass, she gathered the courage to ask. "She was lovely," Clara said softly, her voice nearly lost to the crackle of the fire. He froze mid-motion, one hand on the coffee pot. The silence stretched thin. Then, without looking at her, he poured himself a cup and sat. "My wife," he said finally, "and my daughter." Clara nodded, waiting, but no more words came. He stared into the coffee like it might swallow the rest. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Jonas only nodded once. "So am I." He stood and left the table, stepping out into the dark where the frogs sang by the river. She watched his silhouette fade beyond the porch light, the photograph still flickering in her thoughts. That woman's smile, the little girl's ribboned hair, and the hollow weight Jonas carried like a shadow stitched to his back. The next afternoon brought company, of the kind neither wanted. A small group of settlers passed by, driving a wagon heavy with supplies. They stopped for water and gossip, the lifeblood of the frontier. One of the men recognized Clara, his tone turning sharp. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "If it ain't Eli Hale's widow." "Thought she'd gone east." Clara froze, the bucket half lowered. "You knew my husband?" "Knew of him," the man said, glancing at Jonas, who had come from the barn. "Heard tell of that cattle war down in Clear Fork. Heard he changed sides when things turned ugly. Some called it survival. Others called it betrayal." Jonas's jaw tensed, his silence an answer of its own. The men exchanged looks, then rode on, leaving dust and judgment in their wake. When the sound of hooves faded, Clara turned to Jonas, her eyes burning. "You said nothing," he looked at her then, the lines around his eyes deep as canyons. "What would have been the use?" "To tell the truth," she said. "Truth don't travel far out here," he replied quietly. "Just rumors that ride faster." She wanted to strike him, to shake the words from him, to know whether he, too, believed her husband a coward. But all she could do was stand there, trembling, as the wind carried away what little warmth the day had left. That night, the silence between them turned brittle. Jonas stayed outside long after dark, sitting on the porch with his hat in his hands. The moon came up cold and white, gleaming on the river like a drawn blade. Clara lay awake on her cot, listening to the boards creak beneath his boots when he finally came in. His movements were careful, almost apologetic, but he said nothing. The next morning, she found the photograph gone from the Bible. Only the pressed sprig of sage remained. Days blurred again, but not like before. The air felt heavier, the space between them stretched thin with things unsaid. Clara worked harder, as if scrubbing the floors could erase shame itself. Jonas spoke little, though sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, his gaze lingered, not with judgment, but with something nearer to regret. One evening, she walked to the river. The water had receded some, but its pull was still strong. Driftwood and debris caught in the shallows, twisting endlessly. The current whispered to her, soft as a confession. She thought of Eli, his laughter, his promises, the way he'd smelled of saddle soap and cedar. He had meant well, but meaning hadn't saved him. The world had its own sense of justice. Behind her, she heard Jonas's boots on the stones. "Best not stand too close," he said quietly. "River takes more than it gives." "I know," she said without turning. "But sometimes I wonder if that's what it's for. To take what people can't bear to carry." Jonas didn't answer. The two of them stood there in the hush of the falling dusk, watching the water move like time itself, unstoppable, indifferent. When they returned to the house, the air smelled of rain again. The rocking chair on the porch creaked in the wind, empty but not forgotten. Inside, she set another log on the fire. Jonas sat by the window, his reflection caught in the glass, superimposed over the ghostly outline of the river. He looked like a man half vanished already, tethered to his past by threads he could neither cut nor mend. Clara poured him coffee, set it beside him, and for a moment their hands brushed, brief, accidental, but real. Neither spoke. But something fragile had shifted, not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. Two souls caught in the same undertow, learning slowly that grief had company. Tone and realization, reflective, sorrowful, and quietly tense. The land mirrors their loneliness, frozen between seasons, unable to heal. The realization. The past has roots that drink deeply from the present, and some debts are paid not in coin, but in silence and endurance. The rain came back with a vengeance. It started as a whisper, a mist over the hills, then deepened into a downpour that blurred the horizon. For 3 straight days, the sky emptied itself over the valley, turning every trail into a vein of mud. The river swelled, restless and brown, its voice rising until it drowned out thought itself. From the porch, Jonas watched the water creep closer to the fence line, the current snarling against roots and stones. He'd seen floods before, seen them take calves, wagons, even men. But something about this storm set his nerves on edge. The earth trembled faintly with every surge. Inside, Clara moved through the dim light of the cabin, hanging damp blankets by the stove and wringing out what she could salvage. Her world had shrunk to the sound of rain on the roof, the smell of smoke, and the quiet presence of the man who spoke little and watched everything. On the fourth day, a brief lull came. The clouds thinned to a pale gray, a false calm that made the world feel hushed, waiting. Clara stepped outside to gather what laundry had survived the wind, white linens ghosting on the line, snapping in the wet breeze. She had nearly finished when a gust tore one loose, carrying it toward the riverbank. Without thinking, she ran after it. The ground gave way beneath her boots, slick mud, soft as rot. Her hands reached for something solid, but the bank crumbled like paper. The cold seized her as she plunged in. The river closed over her head, a dark, thrashing silence swallowing her whole. The shock stole her breath. She kicked and clawed, the current dragging her downstream, spinning her like driftwood. Panic flared. The world became bubbles and noise, and the burn of lungs refusing to give up. Then, a shout. Through the blur of rain, Jonas saw the flash of her shawl vanishing into the current. He didn't hesitate. He dropped his hat, stripped his coat, and dove from the bank. The water slammed him sideways, heavy and wild, but he fought his way toward her, every muscle screaming. He caught her just as she went under again, his arm locking around her waist. She struggled weakly, the last of her strength bleeding away, until his voice cut through the roar. "Easy now, I got you." They hit the shallows hard. Jonas half dragging, half carrying her up the bank, until they collapsed beneath the low eaves of the barn. Rain hammered the roof. His breath came in gasps. Clara shivered violently, eyes wide with shock, lips blue. He pulled her closer, wrapping his coat around her, holding her tight against his chest to share what little warmth he had left. "You're all right," he murmured, voice raw. "Breathe." "That's it. Just breathe." She trembled uncontrollably, water streaming from her hair, her fingers clutching the front of his shirt like a lifeline. His heart pounded against her cheek, steady as thunder far away. "Thought you said the river took more than it gave," she whispered faintly. He gave a strained half-smile. "Didn't figure it'd try to take you." They stayed there a long while, two figures huddled beneath the tin roof, the world reduced to breath, heartbeat, and the storm's fury. When her shaking eased, he brushed the wet hair from her face, careful as if she might break. Her eyes met his, and something wordless passed between them. Not gratitude alone, but recognition. When the rain softened to a drizzle, Jonas lifted her to her feet. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you warm before the fever takes hold." Inside, the house smelled of smoke and wet wool. He stripped the soaked shawl from her shoulders and fetched a dry blanket from the cot. She protested weakly, but he ignored it, kneeling to rub warmth back into her arms. His hands were rough, scarred, but gentle. "You should have let the damn sheet go," he said. "It was the last clean one," she murmured, teeth chattering. "Seemed worth saving." He shook his head, a quiet laugh buried in his chest. "You sound like my wife used to." The words hung between them, fragile and unplanned. Clara looked up, but he was already turning toward the stove, setting the kettle on to boil. Thunder rolled outside, low and steady. She watched him in the firelight, the way his shoulders sagged with exhaustion, the dark hair clinging damp to his temples, the quiet steadiness in his movements. He was not a man who sought closeness, yet something in him had changed, the hard edges softened by what the river had forced him to remember. That life, however painful, was still worth the saving. When the kettle whistled, he poured 2 cups and handed her one. The heat burned her palms. They sat across from each other, steam curling between them, the only sound the tick of rain easing against the roof. "Thank you," she said finally. He met her eyes. "Don't thank me. Anyone would have done the same. You don't believe that." He hesitated, then looked into the fire. "No," he said quietly. "I don't." Lightning flared through the window, painting his face in pale relief. In that brief light, she saw the truth of him, the grief that had shaped him, the tenderness he hid beneath silence. The storm deepened again before midnight, wind howling through the cracks. She sat by the hearth, wrapped in his coat, while he checked the shutters and the door. When he finally settled opposite her, the firelight flickered across the lines of his face, softening them. Outside, the land was a blur of grey water and trembling trees. Inside, it was still. The kind of stillness that comes after danger. When survival itself feels like a secret shared, you shouldn't have gone out, he said again, voice low. I'm used to doing things alone, she replied. Jonas stared into the flames for a long while. You don't have to be, she didn't answer. The words lingered like smoke, their meaning settling in her chest long after the fire had burned low. When she finally lay down, wrapped in the blanket he'd given her, the sound of rain became softer, almost forgiving. She watched him through the half-light, sitting at the table, mending a strap by lantern glow. His hands were steady again, his eyes calm, and though he never looked her way, she felt the warmth of his attention, a quiet guardianship that needed no words. Outside, the river kept moving, swollen and alive, its fury spent but not forgotten. Inside, two souls sat beneath the same roof, bound not by past or promise, but by the unspoken mercy of one life saving another. Tone and realization, intimate, redemptive, and quietly electric. Nature's fury mirrors the emotions neither dares to name. The realization, compassion, once awakened, cannot easily be buried again. And in the hush after a storm, even the most guarded heart begins to thaw. The storm passed, leaving the land drenched and shining beneath a pale, washed-out sky. Clara awoke to the soft creak of timbers and the scent of wet cedar. Jonas was already outside, setting ladders against the barn and testing the roof for damage. She joined him without a word, clutching a hammer that felt too heavy for her small hands. Together they worked in a silence that hovered between comfort and caution. The wind had torn away half the shingles. Jonas moved sure and steady while she fumbled, nails slipping through damp fingers. He almost smiled when she cursed softly at a bent nail. You swing like you're asking permission, he said, his voice carrying a dry edge of humor she hadn't heard before. She glanced at him, unsure if he was teasing or testing her, and for a fleeting moment, something lighter passed between them, a thread of warmth too fragile to name. By evening, the light softened across the valley, golden against the soaked earth. They sat on the porch, the air thick with the scent of pine smoke and river silt. She thanked him for saving her life, but he only shook his head. Didn't do it for thanks, he muttered, gaze fixed on the horizon. The fragile peace broke the next afternoon. Dust rose on the road as 6 riders approached, men in oilskins and anger. At their head was Benson, broad-shouldered, jaw set like stone. He called Jonas by name, spoke of missing cattle, of rumors that the widow of Clara Hale had taken shelter here. Clara stood in the doorway, spine straight, though her hands trembled. Benson's eyes flicked toward her, cold with recognition and disdain. Didn't figure you'd take to keeping company with an Apache's widow, he said, spitting near her boots. Jonas's silence was heavier than any words. He neither denied nor defended, and that silence burned hotter than insult. Clara felt the air leave her chest. The men rode off with warnings and smirks, leaving behind the echo of their contempt. That night, the ranch was quiet but for the fire's low crackle. Clara folded her shawl and packed her few belongings into a satchel. Jonas found her by the door, lamplight cutting across his face, showing weariness and something raw beneath. You think leaving makes it right? He asked. It makes it easier, she replied. For you. For me. He took a step closer, the boards creaking under his boots. If you go now, he said, his voice rough, they win. They want you to vanish, same as they wanted me to. Don't give them that. Her throat ached with unshed words. She stayed, not because he'd asked, but because something inside her refused to let fear write the ending. Outside, coyotes called in the distance. Inside, 2 souls shared a silence more dangerous than any storm. Tone and realization, taut, emotional, and restrained. The air between them hums with unspoken longing and wounded pride. The past presses against the fragile present, threatening to break it. The realization, love, when left unspoken, can hurt as much as hatred, and courage sometimes means staying, not running. The wind shifted at dusk, carrying the smell of smoke long before the flames appeared. Clara stood on the porch, her shawl pulled tight, sensing something wrong in the air. Jonas came from the stable, eyes narrowing toward the dark ridge where dust rose. Riders again. Too many and too fast. Benson and his men emerged from the twilight, the glint of their rifles catching the last light. They were drunk, their laughter jagged as glass. "Told you he was keeping her," one jeered. "Traitor's widow and the rancher too coward to send her off." Jonas said nothing, only rested his hand on the shotgun propped against the porch rail. The first torch arced through the air and landed against the barn's dry siding. Fire bloomed like fury. Horses screamed inside, hooves pounding the stalls. Jonas ran toward the flames before Clara could cry out. She followed, skirts snagging on brambles, lungs choking on smoke. Together they wrestled with the latches, driving the terrified animals out one by one. When the men closed in, Benson lifted his pistol, aiming at her. Jonas turned and fired first. The sound cracked the night open. Benson fell backward into the dirt, eyes wide, the torch dying beside him. The others fled, shouts fading into the hills, leaving the ranch wrapped in smoke and silence. The barn gave way before dawn, its roof collapsing in a rush of embers. Clara sat in the dirt, her palms blistered from the heat, watching the fire eat the last of the hay. Jonas knelt beside her, wrapping her hands in a strip torn from his shirt. Blood darkened his sleeve where a bullet had grazed him, but he said nothing of it. "You should have let me go," she whispered, voice hoarse. He shook his head. "Would have burned anyway," he said. "Might as well have something worth saving." When the fire finally died, the two of them sat side by side amid the ruin, blackened beams smoking, stars paling into dawn. The silence was not empty this time. It held everything they could not yet say. Jonas's hand found hers, rough and warm against the bandages. She didn't pull away. Later that morning, as sunlight broke through the lingering haze, Clara stood at the wash basin, her reflection wavering in the rippling water. With slow, deliberate fingers she braided her hair, not the widow's braid of mourning, but a new one, clean and strong. The motion was steady, sure. Jonas watched from the doorway, one arm in a sling, the other holding a mug of black coffee. He didn't speak, only nodded once, as if the gesture itself meant something sacred. Around them, the ranch smoldered but stood, tone and realization, fierce, cathartic, and raw. The night's violence strips away every false boundary between them. Pain becomes proof of life, and mercy becomes their quiet redemption. Realization. Redemption is not found in victory, but in mercy shared between the broken, in the hand that stays, even after the fire. The weeks that followed the fire passed like a long exhale. The valley slowly shed its scars, trading smoke for green. The river, once swollen with fury, ran clear again, and the blackened edges of the pasture softened beneath the first shoots of spring grass. Lawmen came from the nearest town, weary men with badges dulled by dust. They asked their questions while standing in the shadow of the ruined barn. Jonas answered plain and steady, never raising his voice. Clara stood beside him, her bandaged hands clasped, her eyes calm. The sheriff nodded when he saw Benson's body buried near the cottonwoods. "Looks to me," he said quietly, "like the man got what was coming. No arrests were made." Justice in that far country was a matter often settled by the land itself. When the riders left, the silence that followed felt like mercy. Jonas returned to his work, setting new posts where the fire had taken the old ones, coaxing life back into the soil. Clara joined him each day, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, the sun bringing warmth to faces too long shadowed by loss. In the quiet rhythm of work, the scrape of a shovel, the call of a meadowlark, something unspoken began to mend. Nights were gentler now. They shared coffee on the porch, speaking little, but with no edge left in the pauses. Sometimes she read aloud from the worn Bible she'd found months before, her voice low and sure. Once, when rain whispered on the roof, Jonas looked up from his cup and said simply, "You were right to stay." It was the only confession he ever gave her, but it was enough. By the time summer's warmth crept into the valley, the fields had greened, and the river sang softly again. Clara knew it was time. One morning she rose early and began to pack, the same satchel she'd arrived with, now lighter yet somehow fuller. When Jonas came from the barn, she was already saddling the bay mare. He didn't ask her to stay. She didn't offer to. Some bonds, they both knew, could not survive the naming. He walked beside her down to the riverbank, where sunlight played across the water, the same river that had once tried to claim her. They stopped where the current bent around a low stone. She turned in the saddle, meeting his gaze. His hat shadowed his eyes, but she saw the truth there, quiet, enduring, unsaid. "Thank you," she said, though the words seemed too small. He shook his head. "Just glad you made it out," he murmured. She smiled faintly. "We both did." For a long moment, neither moved. Then she touched the reins and turned eastward toward the long road home. Jonas watched her cross the ridge, her braid catching the sun like a line of fire. When she disappeared beyond the rise, he stood alone in the tall grass, listening to the wind move through it. Not lonely now, but alive. Later, he returned to the porch, sat in the old rocking chair, and looked out at the rebuilt corral. A hawk circled above the cottonwoods. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a woman rode toward a future she had earned. He closed his eyes and let the rhythm of the chair carry him, steady, patient, and at peace. Tone and realization, quiet, bittersweet, and redemptive. The violence and sorrow have passed, leaving a peace earned through endurance. The river, once a symbol of danger, now carries renewal. Realization. Love need not be claimed to be real. Sometimes it endures not in promises or touch, but in what remains after parting, the steady hum of life continuing, changed forever.